The biggest Western battles ever filmed. Brutal and realistic, ranked. When people think of Westerns, they usually think of duels, standoffs, and lone gunmen settling scores in the dust. But the real scale of the genre is found somewhere much larger, in the battles, where entire groups collide, where survival becomes collective rather than individual, and where the frontier is no longer about personal pride, but about overwhelming force meeting desperate resistance. These are not the quiet moments of tension before a draw, but the full collapse of order when history itself feels like it's breaking open on screen. Number 1. At the very top of that scale sits The Wild Bunch, a film that doesn't just depict violence, but dismantles the mythology around it. The final battle doesn't feel choreographed in any traditional sense. Instead, it unfolds like controlled chaos. Where movement, gunfire, and reaction overlap in a way that feels almost documentary in its intensity. What makes it so brutal is not just the body count, but the emotional exhaustion behind every action, as if each man involved already knows the outcome, but continues anyway, because stopping is no longer an option that exists inside their world. Number 2. In contrast, the Alamo presents scale in a completely different form, where the brutality is measured not in speed, but in inevitability. The defenders are trapped in a siege that stretches tension across time, rather than moments. And the sheer number of attackers creates a visual pressure that slowly consumes the screen. Every wave of assault reinforces the same idea that bravery here is not about winning, but it's about delaying the inevitable long enough for meaning to exist. Number 3, Little Big Man shifts the experience again by grounding its battle in confusion and fragmentation. Where perspective matters more than choreography. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is not presented as clean or heroic, but as disorienting and overwhelming. Where no single character fully understands the scope of what is happening.
No, we're running out of ammunition. How can this one happen?
The lack of clarity is what makes it feel closer to reality than myth, because real battles are rarely legible from any single point of view. Number 4, Dances with Wolves brings scale back into focus through structural tribal warfare.
Shoot the gun!
But what stands out is how emotionally anchored the violence becomes. Instead of treating the battle as spectacle, it is framed through relationships and shifting loyalties. Which gives every large-scale movement a sense of personal consequence. Every charge and countercharge feels connected in something, rather than something staged. Number 5. Hostiles. Hostiles strips everything further, reducing the battlefield into something almost meditative in its intensity. The violence is not prolonged, but it is deeply grounded. And what lingers is not action itself, but exhaustion. As if every confrontation carries the weight of everything that came before it. The realism comes from restraint, not excess, and that restraint makes every moment feel heavier. Number 6. Ulzana's Raid pushes realism even further into psychological terror, where the battle is not a single event, but a sustained condition. The tracking, pursuit, and intermittent violence creates a sense of exhaustion that builds across time, rather than peak in one moment. It feels less like a battle being watched, and more like a process being endured, where survival depends as much on endurance as on skill. Number 7, Major Dundee, expands the scale again, bringing cavalry movements and border warfare into a more traditional cinematic structure. But even here, there is an underlying instability.
Here comes the second wave, Ben!
In how the conflict unfolds. It is ambitious, uneven, and chaotic in its own way. Reflecting the difficulty of controlling large-scale violence, both in narrative and in reality.
Move mad, Lieutenant. Column of twos. Play us a tune, son.
Yes, sir.
Forward! Ho!
April 19th.
Number 8, The Magnificent Seven remake of 2016 leans fully into modern action styling. Where scale is emphasized through spectacle and coordination rather than realism. The battle is large, visually loud, and heavily structured. but it trades some authenticity for kinetic energy. Turning the siege into something closer to a modern action sequence than a historical conflict. Number 9, the original Magnificent Seven from 1960, approaches the same idea with more restraint. Building its village defense into a slow-burning confrontation. Where the scale feels smaller but more grounded. Each gunman's position matters more individually. And the battle unfolds with clearer spatial logic. Even if the stakes remain high throughout.
You came back for a place like this, a man like you.
Number 10, Cheyenne Autumn. Shifts away from climatic battle structure entirely, and instead presents warfare as pursuit and pressure, where the conflict exists across multiple encounters, rather than a single defining moment. The scale is large, but it is distributed, making the experience feel more like endurance, under constant threat, than a singular engagement.
Sir.
Number 11, Heaven's Gate, attempts to create large-scale frontier conflict on a massive ensemble level. And while its ambition is clear, the pacing and structure make the battles feel uneven in impact. Still, the sheer number of participants and the scope of the Johnson County War setting give it a sense of historical weight that cannot be ignored. Number 12, How the West Was Won, presents Civil War combat.
You wasted your time, man. He's dead.
In a way that emphasizes spectacle and breadth over intimacy.
And not all of it.
Creating vast battlefield imagery that prioritizes visual scale. It feels like history presented in panoramic form, where individual moments are often absorbed into the large flow of movement and smoke. Number 13, while Open Range emphasizes realism and restraint, particularly in how violence is framed as sudden and consequential, rather than prolonged.
wasting a good bullet to ease your pain, you son of a bitch.
Number 14. Jeremiah Johnson and the Revenant. Strip battle scale down even further into survival encounters, where conflict is not structured as war, but as repeated, unpredictable clashes with the environment and the opposing groups. What they lose in scale, they gain in intimacy. Making every encounter feel personal and physically demanding.
Jimmy, you go get the cat.
Number 15. And finally, the Alamo returns as a reminder that scale in the Western battles is often less about complexity and more about inevitability. Where numbers, space, and time all converge toward the same conclusion, and where the meaning of resistance is defined not by victory, but by their decision to stand regardless of outcome. When you step back from all of these films together, what becomes clear is that Western battles are not defined by size alone, but how they interpret violence, whether as chaos, endurance, sacrifice, or collapse. And that is what separates them from single action sequences, because each one is ultimately less about who wins and more about what it costs to remain standing when the frontier stops behaving like a place and start behaving like pressure. Because each one is ultimately less about who wins and more about what it costs to remain standing when the frontier stops behaving like a place and starts behaving like pressure. I'm Wrangler. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share with your friends and comment. Love to hear from you. Till the next one, adios.
The channel for westerns and more.